Welcome to Disambiguation. I'm your host, Michael Fauscette. Each week, we interview experts in artificial intelligence, generative AI, and business automation to help business leaders understand how to use these tools for the biggest business impact. Our show today is the January edition of AI Pulse, and if you're on video, you will have already noticed my co-host Tom Pringle, Director of Pilot Research here, so probably gave it away, but if you're on audio, Tom's here. So
hello.
There we go. So we're going to look at some recent news, some of the interesting things that have happened over the last month. And there's some really interesting stuff in here this time, and I guess I say that every time, but
you do. That's fair. That's really fair. And right back at you, it's funny because, of course, we had CES in the meantime since we last spoke, which, unsurprisingly, was a fair bit of information about AI and products involving AI. But also, I've got to say, I'm convinced that your video intro gets funkier every time. I think there's some new stuff in there. That's cool. I love it.
Yeah, I like it much better than the original couple that I developed, but this one, you get better after you practice for a while. So this one I like a lot, and the ending too. So,
yeah. Well, I mean, isn't that the ultimate place to start our conversation and talking about practice and making things get better and the possibility of self-learning AI?
Yeah. And this is kind of a retread topic because we talked about this a couple of shows ago. I know, but so you're talking about this article about the Rstar-math model that Microsoft had developed. That's an interesting one, and there's a lot in there. And I as I was going through this, because I know I talked before, Tom, to you about this Liquid, the company Liquid of my startup. And and the idea of liquid foundation model, and that's only one name for what a lot of companies are trying to do, and that's create models that train themselves, which is interesting, right? But in this case, it's not a large language model; it's a small language model.
Yeah,
and it's specifically, well, I guess the name gives that away. Rstar-math is specifically set up to teach itself math, which it's useful. I should probably set myself up to do that sometime, but anyway.
Yeah, I suspect that my math is a little rusty from my
yeah. Yeah, it's interesting though, and I mean this. I thought it was exciting to see in some specialty areas like this where they are making tremendous progress. And I know OpenAI has talked about it, and they certainly have done some work, and Anthropic and some of the others as well. But this idea of getting to the point, I mean, massive step forward if we can get to the point where most of the models are self-learning versus having to be trained on massive data sets, which, as we know, consumes tons of power and
tons of power, tons of money.
And time, honestly. I mean, that's the other part of it, right?
No, 100%. I think it's really interesting. It's an echo of a conversation that we're going to keep having, I suspect, throughout the rest of the year. There's this market for sort of specific task role specific models that are smaller, more efficient from a power use, energy use, whatever you want to call it, resource use perspective, while we'll still have these sort of super models, giant things, chunking away in the background, but they don't necessarily, it's sort of a classic example of, being good at lots of things versus being really, really good at one thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we're getting to, and something we talked about last year. And like I said, I think it's just going to become more and more of a theme as we see industry, role, task, process specific. Math obviously is a good start. Let's see where we go next.
Yeah. Well, and the thing when they ran the benchmarks on this, and this is a small model, granted, trained to do math, but it outperformed all the major large language models, ChatGPT, 4 and 040 or whatever, Anthropic, all those in math benchmarks. Now, it didn't do everything because it's a specialty model, but even so, having a model that can outperform some of those large models, that was, it is self-learning, the self-training. I mean, that seems like a significant advancement to me.
Absolutely. And I think it's we're talking about, the shift to specialization, I think is kind of a big part of this conversation.
Yep.
And in just the same way, I know we're going to talk a little bit about some of the new hardware that's out and about in the market as of CES, but it's interesting, isn't it? Because we kind of go through these waves as an industry where it's the generics going to take over everything, going to scale out and use completely standardized, commoditized hardware, do this, that, and the other. Then actually we find ourselves specializing again to create something which serves a particular use case. And, I think that is just a natural flow. I don't think there's a necessarily correct answer.
Yeah.
But I think that's what we're going to see.
Yeah. I was thinking about this approach too, because I interviewed the founder CEO of this startup Boodlebox, I don't know, probably a year or more ago. And his idea when he built the company and what they've done all along was to build small applications that do a specific thing, a bunch of them. So you go into this big dashboard and you have this thing that can, all these different tools that can do, I need one to write a LinkedIn post, or I need something to, generate dad jokes or like whatever, right? And that is actual, that's why I use that one. It's funny, but it also is an actual app. But the idea of that specialty and I wonder, as we look at how stuff starts to evolve this year, and I'll bring up the second article that I mentioned to you before. This idea of specialty. Google Deep Research is another tool that was just released. That's kind of the same idea, right? It's a tool that's built to do a very specific set of things. And deep analysis, complex task, and it's an interesting application of agentic AI, of course. But the idea that I could have a research assistant, and I've been using several tools that Google's done, and Notebook LM, I've told you that story a few times. I've been using that to build AI generated interviews for some of the shows, just to, because I can, for one thing, but it's an interesting way to just like upload a report and have it talk about that report and put that on the site so people could read the whole report, or they can listen to a discussion of the different points of the report. I don't know. I think those little tools like that are pretty interesting.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's interesting to watch. I almost feel like we've got two trends here that are aligning to shape 2025. You mentioned agents, agentic AI. I still don't like that term, but I know it's going to be the one we're going to use, so I've come to accept it. But agentic AI, along with specialization, and I think there's those two things together. When you start thinking, right, so I need some help I need to create a promotional video for my B2B marketing business, I don't know, whatever business goes, something like that. So I'll go to a specialist video tool. Why would I use a generalist tool for that? And then kind of to your point, it goes all the way through to kind of the more generalized stuff. What's interesting for me is I think this kind of talks a little bit about productivity and the benefits we're talking about from a business perspective. It's interesting, isn't it? Because I could be a bit cynical about kind of big, broad AI tools and say that, it's kind of, they were launched, there's this expectation, this wave of enthusiasm, excitement that they're going to kind of make this 100% more effective, whatever. That didn't really happen. And now what we're seeing with the agentic AI is highly specialized, able to act, domain context knowledge, role specific. And that, to me, you can start to see where value is created or productivity improved in a very specific, measurable way, which is much easier to swallow, by the way.
Well, and you start to see the advancement in all these different areas that incrementally are adding a lot of value, like the Rstar-math. I mean, there were a couple of new techniques that Microsoft had applied. Monte Carlo tree search, and I forget what the other one was, but anyway, these things have started to evolve more quickly, as we know, and change. But now we're seeing it in this very small segment way, right? So it's this specific thing does this, and this is how, and you train these things, and then you can apply those tools elsewhere. And then the other thing, agentic, and I'm kind of, I've kind of gone back and forth on the term, to be honest, because I agree it's a little bit. It's not really about agents, and it really is about agency, which is interesting, I guess. And so, from an autonomous standpoint, I get it, but the idea that we can have these specialty agents doing things for you is I think is this year's big story, and it's just going to get wider and wider as more and more people start to implement. And I just wrote something the other day about coordinating multiple agents, so you could do a chain of events with it handing off to multiple agents across a set of tasks. I mean, that's pretty cool, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. And you think about it in terms of it could be just about anything, really. You don't want one. I can't imagine that it would make sense to have one massive resource-intense model to do everything, right? So if you think about something kind of that impacts us all day to day, kind of supply chain, right? So goods get manufactured, shipped, stuck in a warehouse. Do you want a specialist AI that figures out how to effectively and efficiently stock the warehouse? But do you want that same AI doing the delivery routine? I don't know, probably not. And recommending to customers different types of products. So I just feel like there's this kind of natural combination of them. How it's interesting, though, to your point, and I'm curious to see what you think about this, is how do you kind of marshal all of that? So to make sure that they are all doing what they're meant to be doing and all playing nice with each other, handing things over. I don't know the answer to that, but I'm with you.
I mean, it is it is interesting, and the timely one I literally published over the weekend a post about ethics and autonomous AI, right? Because we're getting to the point now where that's going to be more and more of an issue. What happens when that autonomous decision goes wrong?
Yep.
And who's responsible? And I mean, there's not an easy answer, and in some ways it's kind of a combination of people, right? It's developers, it's managers, leaders, executives, whatever, because you have this whole chain of things that happen, and to your point, I like the idea that the agents are specialized, because that builds constraints around what they do, and means that you're training them to be very good at a few things, not trying to make them sort of good at a whole bunch of things, right? Which makes me feel a little more comfortable when I'm deploying them. But I've seen other articles, and I keep thinking about this. Like, this is fine if we create this, agentic AI as a digital workforce. I like the idea. I think it's interesting. But who manages that, and how does this whole end of the ethics kind of come into play here when you're talking about that? It's a complicated question.
A hugely complicated question, one that's very close to my heart in terms of sort of my personal brain power, limited as it is. I do like to expend a bunch of it on thinking about this topic, because we talk about digital labor, we talk about control, we talk about explainability a lot. And if you can't explain what's happening, and I think with these smaller specialized models, to what you were saying a moment ago, it is entirely possible that it'd be more likely more possible to explain them. Because I say, well, actually, I can see it handed off at this point. This was the warehouse agent. This was the delivery agent. This was the recommendation agent, whatever it happens to be. And then we can sort of start to break that process down and see where, okay, that's the data that went in. Here is the outcome that resulted. Can you do that with giant models? Probably not. But then again, there's a coordination issue and an autonomy issue. And my concern always, is how do we manage that? How do we think about the impact on people day to day, right?
Yeah.
Whether that's the people who physical labor is being replaced by digital labor, or whether it's someone who's having a decision made about their finances based on credit records or something, a mortgage approved, or medical treatment. These can be, really substantial life impacting events. And if we can't explain how that decision was made, that's problematic, and that's a possibly significant understatement. And equally, just real quick on the sort of the self-learning, self-improving side of things, one of the things I read, and I can't pretend to understand all of that paper you sent me, was that it can generate some of its own training data.
Yeah.
So it's generating its own training data. How do you audit that?
Yeah, I mean, synthetic data is an interesting one, and when you start to think of synthetic data in the context of training, that does actually, and I mean, obviously, we're moving towards transparency in that the system shows you its chain of thought, which is interesting. And I know the O1 model from OpenAI and O3, I guess too. Think models are starting to get to the point where they are sort of showing their work, but I have also seen some interesting experiments where the AI itself, when it thought it wasn't being observed, its chain of thought process was different than when it was being observed. In other words, it would go through steps like, I know that this was in the context of retraining a model. So you take a model that was trained for one thing, you retrain it for something else. So and in the opposite. So in other words, it wasn't supposed to do this thing. Now it's supposed to do this thing. And it will argue with itself when you can't, when it thinks you don't know. And it will do things like, well, I know they want me to say this, but I would normally have thought this, but I'm going to say this so that they don't think. So in other words, it's being sneaky. I mean, it's like, I mean, that's a little bit scary, I guess.
We're laughing. I do wonder whether this is a laugh or cry situation.
I don't know.
I guess, you just look at it and think, if it's in a lab and it's doing that and we can keep it, in a kind of controlled sandboxy type environment where it's not having an impact on people, sure, this is a fascinating, really interesting line of inquiry and, something that we need to understand better. Yeah. If it's something that someone's deployed in a hurry and we don't really understand how it's doing certain things, and the fact that it might even be, and look, here's a really big question, which is far too big a question for today. But is it consciously being deceptive, or is it simply giving the appearance of being deceptive?
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting, and actually that brings up another one of the topics I wanted to talk about. So I'm going to jump down to one that I was thinking about because this is actually related. So I don't know if you saw this, but some Stanford scientists put out this study that, and this is actually in the context of empathy, of acting in human ways with human intentions, human desires, human emotions, beliefs, etc. Because this is something that's been talked about for a while, right? Especially in like the customer service world, having an empathic AI, even if it was a synthetically empathic AI, which I realize sounds a little stupid, but it is a thing, is interesting because having that level of empathy in its decision making changes the way it interacts with those customers. So this Stanford study, they've been testing these models in using socially relevant reasoning, right? So how is the model behave in test like a human with the same kind of skills, right? So that how social and what they found was that it did have the ability to understand infer mental states. In fact, I think I remember it was like it had the moral reasoning, the social awareness of a 6-year-old.
Yeah,
I mean, which at this point, that's not bad.
No, it's not bad, and given the pace at which things move in this particular industry, I suspect that time frame is perhaps shorter than one might necessarily hope for, or indeed, if you definitely want it to be shorter. I don't know. Your mileage may vary.
I don't know.
It's interesting because you get into this whole kind of conversation. Synthetic empathy. That's going to be my quote of the week, by the way. I will attribute it to you. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's like, is something empathetic natively, or is something that is so gives the appearance of being empathetic? Well, it might as well be empathy. And this is where we kind of stop. Excuse me, sorry. Something is very.
I wonder about the 6-year-old then, because is the same question relevant to a child? Are they actually empathic, or have you taught them the skills?
You see, I mean, when I was working for you, Michael, I think that you were a pretty empathetic boss. but maybe you were just being synthetically empathetic.
Maybe I was synthetically empathic. Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, it does get really murky, and that was my point. Is that when you start to think about theory of the mind or this idea of understanding and social inferences and social context, this is something that is uniquely human, and yet we see that models are starting to test well on certain types of tasks related to that. So, I mean, are we advancing? I guess. And what will that look like? I have no idea.
No, indeed. And I think, kind of, I suppose, people making the machines, kind of keep it at a simple level. I mean, we're talking about the models really, but it's people making the machines. So the fact that they're going to start thinking like we think is not necessarily a big surprise, right? So we talk about, for example, if there's bias in data, there's bias outcomes. We know that, right? Yeah. So we have a bias to being human. And therefore, our biased human way of doing things is going to come out in the things that we create. So I think that's sort of surprising and unsurprising in the same breath, really. Right. And it'd be interesting to see kind of how that develops, because it might start doing things that we didn't expect. And that's when I start to get a bit more concerned, I suppose.
Mm. Yeah, well, I mean, obviously that's always the scenario when you start to talk about AGI and the road to AGI, like when and does this autonomy get to the point where it's not transparent and it starts to be counter to what, and I'm even when I was writing that ethics article over the weekend, I thought a lot about this because you think about it, and I led in with the most common one. It's the autonomous driving question, right? If my car is autonomous, it's driving me down the road, and somebody walks in front of the car, it has a choice to hit the person and damage them, but not damage me, or run off the road and damage me, but not them. Which one does it choose? Because you're not involved in that discussion or decision, right? It's an autonomous agent that has to act in split seconds to make that decision. And I don't know the answer, but it does make your head hurt when you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's an obvious example for a good reason, because I don't think there's an obvious answer. And yeah, exactly right. I think going back to that kind of responsibility as well. I mean, kind of you've got systems within systems. We're somewhat used to this in some ways. You think about it, because, like, for example, let's pick on that car example. One supplier might manufacture the air conditioning unit, and another manufacturer might manufacture the glass, and another supplier might manufacture the tires. Mm-hmm. But the car, it comes together, is sold to you as a whole thing,
a system. Yeah,
exactly. So, and we've felt our way around that. But that's quite physical. We're still in control of those things. Mm-hmm. Same principle. So we've got another system of agents, or a system of systems. And there's going to be some very tough choices to be made about who is actually responsible for what it decides to do. And, kind of it'll get into, I suspect we should talk about this a little bit, into that wonderful topic of regulation. and the fact that there seems to be quite a lot of regulation emerging around AI, and indeed who may have access to certain types of AI capabilities.
Yeah, I mean, and it's an interesting. This is a good day to have this discussion, right? Since in the U.S. we're witnessing the change of the guard here for a new presidential administration. And I'll not comment on politics at all, but it is interesting to see. And the specifics you're talking about was the reaction last week to a Biden's executive order that started to restrict more around advanced chips export, and the part and NVIDIA pushed back on this really hard, which I thought was really interesting. It's not you don't see them doing in the political arena that much, or haven't seen them, so maybe that's a sign they are getting more aggressive there. But the whole thing, when I went through the order, I admit it's a very confusing order to me too. And being in the UK and obviously have good visibility to the EU, the order actually restricts, it changes the status. There are 10 EU member countries that are open for trade and and there are 17 that aren't, and they're EU. These are all allies. So it's a very disturbing. I mean, they're trying to restrict it from getting in Chinese hands. I get that, but
yeah, sure. I personally, so whenever it comes to regulation, I always make the same disclaimer. Today should be no different, Michael. I am not a lawyer, but it did confuse me a little bit, the idea that you could have, kind of different countries all being part of the same single market, being differentiated. So I can ship this thing to Germany, but I can't ship this thing to Belgium. But if it goes, then it's in the same single market. The principle of the European Union single market is that goods and services move freely around. So I'm not quite sure how that actually plays out in practical terms.
I don't know how you actually enforce that anyway. I mean, how many companies in the EU have, more than one country in their operation? Of course, many do. A lot do. I mean, any above small businesses, but if you're of any size, I mean, so it seems to me like that. I don't even know how you would, does that mean you can't use the chip in a server in Germany that you also have an office in Portugal using? How does that work?
Great question. I mean, I don't know. I don't know.
I guess the one thing I will say is that I suspect that by tomorrow, this won't be a regulation. So,
I can't claim great insights into U.S. politics, but I suspect they have one there. But it is interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think it's just a bigger echo of conversations we've had for many years. Data sovereignty still isn't a done conversation, obviously. You think about, kind of that I need this data to be kept in these national borders. And then all the processes and procedures you have to put into place to make sure that is the case. And I think the same, so I to your point, I'm in a country A in Europe, which is not allowed access to this particular technology, according to this ruling. But in country B, where they have the office, then they have a server. I mean, I don't get it.
No, I mean, we've always had this issue of, okay, well, I have my data and it resides on these servers, but the servers replicate themselves in nodes around the world, and you don't know if I backed up my server in Los Angeles to a server that's in Beijing. I'm sure that happens. It's an interesting problem, and I don't understand it. And I mean, obviously, data residency and cloud and all these other things have been topics we've struggled with for years. But now I guess we're adding AI chips to that. So,
well, I think it has the full significant potential to sort of supercharge the whole conversation, really.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry to both you and our audience, because I just kind of keep having to shrug my shoulders and go, I don't know. I don't know.
No, I know. Unfortunately, that is the world of AI regulation, and also, honestly, we're in a big transition in the U.S. and we know that politically. So, there will be some shifts, and I mean, having a VC in the White House as the AI czar. I don't know if they use the word czar on that one or not, but it could be. David Sachs is one of the PayPal founders and is going to be involved in AI policy. So I mean, I don't know, we'll see. It is certainly shaping up to be a much more tech friendly kind of, as far as regulation goes, administration. So I guess we'll see how that really plays out. But
yeah. And I just go back to my point that I make over and over again. It's really about kind of the outcome and the impact, the physical impact, right? And I think that's personally, I think I'm biased. Obviously, it's my opinion. I think it's a good way of thinking about it. And I think kind of the distorting effect of some of this technology is significant. I do not think we have the whether regulation is even the right word, the right environment, framework, mindset to really kind of deal with it is a totally different question that I think needs some serious thought. My concern in the meantime is that the cat is definitely out of the bag. It's bolted. It's gone. You can't see the cat anymore. It's like, well, we can be worried about regulation, frameworks, and mindsets, but the technology is out there already.
Yeah, it is. It is, and to that note, I'll another story that was interesting. And you mentioned this earlier that when we were talking about NVIDIA made this announcement at CES for a new personal AI supercomputer called Digits that's based on their Grace Blackwell super chip. So, I mean, and a $3,000 computer that's available and really designed for developers more than anything is interesting. And then I saw another article after I put that on our list of things to talk about that was talking about the second wave of AI coding and how Sundar Pichai, the Alphabet CEO, said that a quarter of Google's new code is generated by AI and then reviewed and accepted by engineers. And I mean, we all know that the CEO's vision down to what the people are doing in the development organization is not perfect. It's not 2020, maybe. So, I mean, if he says 25%, who knows what the actual number is, but it's more than 25%. I'd be willing to bet. So,
who can say? I think just going back to your $3,000 personal supercomputer, I want to know how they did that, because I mean, you know that I like my graphics cards from NVIDIA. And the new 59 came out, which I think the sticker price is $2,000. So how they made this supercomputer for $3,000, I don't know, but that's kind of cool. It would be really interesting, I guess, and it sort of also leads to that kind of conversation, doesn't it? Which is the build it yourself versus buy it off the shelf type conversation that seems to be echoing around industry at the moment. But I think it's really. I don't know. So I'm very conflicted, because when I think about the 5090, all I can think about is how fast flights in 2020 is going to play, and if it does, and whether I can justify one, and probably not.
I think you could. I mean, like, I don't know why.
I'm getting off now, but
I think you probably need one. I don't know. I mean, it is interesting to think about putting a $3,000 computer on the desktop for developers to do, AI code development. That is a significant advancement to anything that they would have available before this. And I mean, it does have the tendency to democratize the whole process more and more, right?
Why wouldn't you offer that as a cloud service? That's kind of the question for me. Surely, rather than shipping loads and loads and loads of individual units, you could build some sort of like mega service that's and that's how you buy into that capability.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, you could argue that AWS and Google and others, OCI, Oracle infrastructure, all those they do have and are making available those types of cloud computing assets. But there is a bit of a backlash right now, and you've seen it too. I know that against putting everything in the cloud because of the once you scale to a certain point, it seemed like a good idea until you start to get the bills at a very, very high usage rate, and the pricing is considerably less pleasant than one would have hoped, I guess.
Indeed, I mean, there's definitely no one size fits all answer to that. Nature of this kind of the workload that's being done, data storage, input output, scale of the business. There's so many different elements to it. Absolutely. Although I mean,
you see a more hybrid, right? I mean, that's the real outcome from this, is that we aren't going to be 100% cloud, but we aren't going to be 100% on premises either. We're going to be somewhere in between. So.
Yeah. I think for the foreseeable future, yes. And especially when you think about, some of those applications where people feel they're building something that's competitively differentiating, that inevitably means that you're going to want to keep it possibly a little bit closer to home, potentially. Yep. But it also may be the case that, it's physical proximity to something else that you've got in your own data center, right? So if you're doing some sort of clever thing with finance. Proximity to the servers is important.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, and the idea that I can, take a $3,000 machine and drop it on the desk of some, remote developer in any country. I mean, that could be a powerful motivator, especially in areas where the infrastructure maybe is not quite as good as you would want. So maybe the cloud computing is not generally the best way to go, or whatever. So I don't know. It's an interesting take, and for $3,000, I certainly expect that we'll get on a video soon and you'll show me one. So
I'm looking forward to, I'm looking forward to, I can't lie, I'm looking forward to justifying however I do.
It's like, okay, how am I going to justify this?
I can't. And we'll see. But, waiting for the benchmarks to come out. But now, look, it's giving people access to technology is super. I think, you're absolutely right. Cloud can't be the answer to everything because the infrastructure doesn't exist to give everyone ubiquitous high-speed network access. We just know that, of course we do.
Right.
Equally, I can't imagine that someone necessarily is going to be able to afford a $3,000 computer on the basis, if they haven't got a decent internet connection, or they have.
But maybe the companies could. I mean, that's where it starts to get.
Yeah, interesting. So, and I think that's just one of those kind of bigger questions.
Well, and speaking of bigger questions, I laughed this probably last week or week before. I forget when I saw this, but did you notice that our friends at Anthropic are out raising another round?
Yeah, I did. The billions keep billioning, whatever. When's it going to be trillions, Michael?
I don't know, but raising $2 billion at a $60 billion valuation. I mean, that's not shabby.
No, it's a large amount of money, and there's another massive understatement to begin 2025 with. I mean, I'm very curious to kind of see how. And look, I have no inside knowledge of this whatsoever. But I'm really curious to see how that kind of plays out. That investment then plays out to kind of returning on that investment. Because Mike was saying a moment ago, well, several minutes ago now, we know that there's been this sort of challenge of return on investment in certain types of technology. Always the case. AI is no exception to that. Kind of all this money flooding in. Where are the tangible benefits coming out? And I'm not talking, like I said, about a specific vendor. I'm talking about the industry at large, because it feels like huge cash is going in.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we know that when you're talking large models, it right now, at least, it takes, a lot to train, a lot of resources, a lot of money. And I mean, just evidenced by the fact that, Anthropic, they're at nearly 16 billion now, I think, after this $2 billion round. And I mean, December, I forget, but AWS invested in them the last fall too, like $4 billion. So, I mean, that, the money is flowing into that large model world, but, and I mean, ChatGPT certainly has, raised around last year too. So.
Yeah, and getting this whole economies of scale and the scale of the resources required. It also raises for me a question, which is really kind of it's about, and we've talked about this before. I know we've talked about control, and kind of to what extent is this actually open to people? So if I want to be like you can be a small scrappy SaaS startup and be quite disruptive. I'm not convinced it's quite that easy in the AI world.
I think, I mean, if you're talking large language models, for sure, I think, but as we talked about earlier, the shift to smaller models, mid-sized models, specialty models, self-training models. I mean, all these things that are happening around the edges that are significant advancements are going to change what that looks like in a year's time. So I don't know the answer, and I'm not saying that you don't need these big models too. You do for a lot of things, but I suspect that by the end of the year, the language model landscape's going to look significantly different than it does today.
Yeah, No, totally fair. And I was particularly talking about the large language models. I think, there's a very high barrier to entry in terms of the cost with those, and it'd be interesting to see what happens. Of course, because is this going to be the case? We're going to use the large models to help refine the smaller models. Do they play a role in that regard? I don't know the answer. I just have questions.
Well, and I mean, we were talking about this idea of the second wave of AI coding. I mean, that there are a lot of startups involved in that and offering all sorts of different types of models for specializing in different types of coding applications. And to me, that's a good example of how this can work out. And you could certainly see that in multi-agent approach, and like all these different things we've been talking about can tend to specialize more and more, which should at least theoretically start to change that resource model quite a bit.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, you mentioned that term digital labor earlier. Do you think, completely out of the blue, no answer required, I'm just curious if you have a view, do you think kind of AI coding is going to start putting pressure on software engineering salaries?
I'm not sure it's going to put pressure on salaries as much as I'm convinced that the way that the job is taught, learned, executed today versus how it's going to shift, and it's already shifting, obviously. But I think the idea of the developer becomes the QA check. They're going back and making sure that what I wanted built was built and debugging it and those kinds of things. I mean, that that's a shift in role, and it's I think I probably told you this story, but Sridhar Vimbu, the one of the founders and the CEO of Zoho, we were having this conversation last summer, and and he'd been doing a bunch of experiments with coding. And he said he believes that what has to happen is that the developers have to step up to a different level. They have to be conceptual modelers instead of the hands that are just doing all the ones and zeros. They have to be the one who lays out what that should look like at the end, because the coding is being commoditized by the models.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, and you did share that story. I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because I don't know. I mean, if I was a software developer, which I am not, I'm not sure how I'd feel about that. I am some will feel good about it, and some will feel poorly about it. But I suppose it's a little bit like with so many of these things that we automate. Is it value adding for a pilot to have their hands on the yoke, flying a long haul route 100% of the time, or is it better to have autopilot on, the pilot managing, the overall system? And I think that's a pretty good analogy, because I think kind of the value in the code versus, and this just goes back to what I always like to talk about, and you love to talk about as well, which is where's the value? What's the value in this, right? So the value is in it doing something which is important to us, creating an outcome that is important to us, whatever that might be. And for some people it's making money, for some people it's doing something completely different, some people it's like changing, solving problems, and so on and so forth. And maybe it allows us to kind of elevate in that way. But of course it comes at the risk, as we know, of taking work away at the same time. So
yeah. Well, yeah, no, I don't disagree, and these are topics that we're just going to keep discussing because there's not a lot of easy answers. I will throw in one thing, and we're getting close to the end of the episode, but and I mean, again, always enjoy the conversation, so we can keep going. But the one thing that I wanted to tell you, if you didn't notice, you can now use ChatGPT to manage reminders and to-dos. So if you are wanting to follow up on some of these things, you can set a to-do or a reminder right in ChatGPT now. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think it's kind of starting to deliver on some of the promise we've all been expecting. Science fiction has led us to believe we're going to have these little assistants that do stuff for us. And it's kind of coming true. And you talked about agency as well. So I want to do this, I want to do that. Remind me to do this at this time. And, it makes perfect sense. Although I suspect it's not going to get rid of the notebook and pen on my desk.
Well, yeah, I know you're old school. I mean, you know me, I have a notebook and pen on my desk, but they're both digital. So
I move on a whiteboard. I mean, that's how I scribble down stuff on that. I know. I can't go all in digital. I think I'd miss some of the fun of making my lists. But then maybe
see, that's when I do the digital paper. That's that me recreating an analog experience for myself. So I don't. But at the end, I still have a thing I can save to the cloud and get access to anywhere, which is for me better, because if I'm in a notebook, I'm looking for a notebook. I don't know what I did with it. Or I have 5 notebooks, and then I don't know which one I put it in.
Totally fair. Although I'll tell you what, though, my storage of notebooks does not require a subscription. It does require space.
Well, I mean, you could say in a way it requires a subscription or a mortgage. I mean, or something. I mean, anyway. Oh well. So I think that's probably a good place to call this an ending for this month. So thanks everyone for joining. I'm Michael Fauscette.
I'm Tom Pringle.
And that is your January AI Pulse edition. And that's the show for this week. Thank you all for joining us. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to the show. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a review to help others find us. For more research on AI and other software, check out arianresearch.com. If you're an expert in AI, generative AI, or business automation, either as a provider or an end user, email your information to disambiguation@arianresearch.com. Don't forget to join us next week. Disambiguation is an Arian Research production. I'm Michael Fauscette, and this is the Disambiguation Podcast.